Hello, and welcome to Expected Value, the podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world. I'm Paul Carr from True Media. This is episode 61 of the show, our Roger Maris episode. And we do not have a baseball person today. You can check our archives for lots of baseball shows. But we do have someone with one of the most varied resumes you'll find in the sports analytics space. He's worked for, among others, FanDuel, the Utah Jazz, Austin FC and MLS, as an on-air TV analyst for the Blazers, and he also founded a golf analytics company. So his name is Cory Jez, and we could easily spend a whole show talking about any one of those jobs. We're going to try to keep it relatively tight, hit the high notes on all those different roles, talk about how he got started in the sports analytics industry, what he's done at each of those stops, building data teams and processes from scratch, working across all these different sports, bringing analytics to television and the challenges that go into that, how to communicate data well, and a whole lot more. Then producer Sergio de la Espriella will join me to react and wrap things up. Without further ado, here is the Expected Value Conversation with Cory Jez. We're joined now on Expected Value by Cory Jez, former team executive, analyst, entrepreneur, worked in a whole bunch of different sports. Cory, welcome to the show. We could spend a whole pod talking about almost any one of these career stops, but we'll try to keep it relatively concise. Let's just start at the beginning professionally for you. What was your academic early career background even before you got into the sports world?
Yeah, Paul, thanks so much for having me. Love jumping on talking about kind of how this stuff works in today's day and age in sports. My start to it was it's dissimilar to everybody else's, because I always say this field, sports analytics, sports technology, is it's very there's so many unique paths that people can take. It's not like being a lawyer or a doctor, right? There are lawyers who do this stuff. Shout out friends of the program, Seth Partnow. But I'm sure there's doctors. I'm sure there's someone with an MD who does sports analytics too. But graduated 2011, economics undergrad, Virginia Tech. Literally everybody with an economics degree in the Mid-Atlantic. I moved to DC and became a consultant. And I learned things like SQL and Tableau, and was like, I literally remember when I learned what linear regression was, because I was asking someone about deciding how much weight to put on something like carries or yards per carry for my fantasy football team in 2011 or 2009 or whatever year it was, right? And I was, back then the guy with the Excel model. Now the models have gotten a little more mature and complicated, but kind of that was my gateway drug to all of this stuff. So I spent about 4 or 5 years consulting, kind of building the chops. Like I said, I had an econ degree, so I wasn't particularly technical myself in terms of software development, which I still wouldn't claim to be a software developer, but I can break a few things here and there. And then kind of jumped into sports, FanDuel, and then the NBA about 5 or 6 years into my career after that. But it was a great early on in my career, and the advice I give to people, early on is I got really good at some of the tools of the trade. Even Python and R were in 2010 a little more nascent, certainly, than they are now. But learning SQL, learning Tableau, and then getting into the more advanced stuff, hands-on with those things every day professionally. It's a lot easier when you're doing it at work every day, as opposed to trying to boot camp at night or in your spare time as well.
Yeah. So your first sports job was as an analytics manager with FanDuel in 2015, which is an eternity ago in kind of sports analytics gambling circles. Where was FanDuel at as a company when you started there, and what did you do there?
Yeah, so I was there 15 to 17, I want to say. And it was when it was like every commercial on television was either a FanDuel or a DraftKings commercial, right? And it was me wanting to transition into my career in sports. Previously as a consultant, I was doing analytics on any and everything, business, marketing, etc. It was all, kind of boring, and wanting to make that transition. The Moneyball stuff is starting to happen, right? And so FanDuel was a very rapidly growing company, and a lot of the work I did. So my group was mainly the business analytics group, but there's a huge tie-in into what's going on in the sports world. Back in those days before they were a sports book, it was answering questions like, well, how big should this tournament, we called them GPP, general prize pool, of, are we going to get 100,000 people to play NBA tonight? Or are we going to get 500,000 people to play in the big NBA contest tonight, or football or basketball? And if the Steph Curry Warriors are playing, the then James Harden Rockets or something like that, a lot more people are going to play basketball that night because it's a, Tuesday, Thursday national game. And that would change our demand modeling for the size of the business that day, because the way we would maximize our profit margin on a given night, on a given contest, was by having exactly the size of the contest that would the supply and demand was met perfectly, right? Like everybody who wanted to play played, but we didn't have any unfilled seats, and we didn't have anybody else waiting outside, because those were, 1 million people would play in a big Sunday NFL contest or something like that. So I remember debates of like, do we list James Harden as a point guard or a shooting guard? Things like that when Chris Paul goes to the Rockets, or situations like that. So, how do you set the salaries for the players, and how do you do so in a way to, be representative of the sport, obviously, but also to try to balance the skill versus, the skill curve. There's a, very Pareto kind of dynamic going on with the players in daily fantasy sports, of you have 5% of the players win 85% of the money, or there's a lot of sharps and then a lot of fish, and you're trying to balance the sharks don't eat all the fish, basically. So you still have your player population. So it was problems like that. Building an analytics group, building a centralized analytics capability from the ground up, which I think was, one of the things. I think then going into a front office setting, having kind of we were a growing company, lots of, we weren't perfect by any means, but having kind of a proper corporate analytics and from consulting days as well, background, to then going into pro sports, especially when you're in charge of the technology kind of component of whether it's basketball or football or soccer operations, I think was a huge benefit, because you were really comfortable with how to run meetings, how to set agendas, how to do sprint reviews, how to, prioritize and have back then it was Jira. Now it's tools that I like a little more, but how to do project scoping, right? And all these things that are kind of the meta about how you work. And I think there's some organizations who've gotten a lot better in pro sports, and there's probably still a lot of organizations who kind of stink at that in pro sports as well.
Yeah, that kind of leads to a quote, I think it was on your website. You said that, quote, being more data-driven as a club, ironically, has much less to do with models and more to do with full stack technology. I think I understand what you're saying, but could you just expand on that, kind of how it applies to, some of those teams that you've dealt with?
Yeah, I think having the model, and I'm kind of using that term almost ironically here, but whatever the data point is, right? And that could actually be a model. It could be your draft model, NFL draft coming up, right? How do you value Bijan Robinson, for example, or how do you value Victor Wembanyama, or whatever? It could be an advanced metric, whatever it is. If you can't get it integrated into your decision-making protocol as an organization, like you've done 80% of the work of the tech work, right? To do the data engineering and the machine learning and the data viz and the da-da-da. But if it lives in like a PDF or an Excel doc or an email, it's never going to see the light of day, right? Especially with modern decision makers, and thinking about all the things, choose whatever sport, but thinking about all the things that a decision maker has to know with the draft or free agency or trade deadline, or in a coaching context of preparing for an opponent or a playoff series. And if you don't have an integrated way to get that information into your decision making process, then you're up the creek without a paddle, And so when I say it's more about full stack technology, I mean the full stack technology as the tools to get that into your integrated decision making process, to say, hey, scouts who are going to be traveling all over the country looking at basketball prospects, here is the player page of every college basketball player, and here's their shot chart, and here's their catch and shoot off the dribble numbers, and here's what our models think about them, and here's their school strength of schedule and the adjustment because they're in a bad conference or a good conference, and blah, 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 and their wingspan and data, there's hundreds of data points, right? And if you kind of let everybody do it their own way, they're all going to go get their own data points from their other sources, and oh, well, this guy's a good 3-point shooter, but this guy's not. And all these things, you need to bring that in and really narrow that down to say, here are the things we care about. Here's what's important. We all need to be on the same page. We're all going to use numbers. Every scout, you can be the least analytics friendly. Charles Barkley uses numbers, right? And so we just want, the people in our organization or whatever context you're in to be using the right ones. You have the people in charge of your analytics, department capability. It's their job to know what the right numbers are and to surface those to the group and to get them into those decision makers' hands. And so, yes, you need data scientists. Yes, you need people to build the predictive models. You also, if I was to start an analytics group from scratch, make believe team, and I had an unlimited budget, data scientist like the third or fourth person I'm hiring probably. It's data engineer first, and it's a web developer pretty close behind, and maybe a couple of each, because you have to get that infrastructure in place, and then that predictive modeling or advanced metric component is part of the infrastructure.
So from FanDuel, you went to the Jazz where you were the director of basketball analytics. What did that mean, especially at the time when it was, again, it was only 5-6 years ago, but it was kind of a long time in analytics time. Really.
Yeah.
So what did you do with the Jazz there?
Yeah. So they had one person there previously, Taylor Snar, who's still very, has a great website, Dunks and Threes. He was with the Jazz previous to that. And, was really coming in and trying to grow and kind of modernize the department and modernize the group. The group now, depending on how you count, is probably 4 or 5 or 6 people. It was 1 in 2016, 17. So to your point, and at most basketball teams, most NBA teams are probably in the, half dozen to dozen head count now in this space. And so it was a lot of bit of everything, not a little bit of everything. It was a lot of bit of everything, but rebuilt our tech infrastructure more than once in 3 or 4 years, and made some good decisions, made some bad decisions, and iterated and brought all of our technology in house under basketball operations. So took it out of the locus of control of the IT group and other centralized groups. For people who've worked in kind of traditional software development roles, things work in sprints and proper prioritization protocols and things, and that just doesn't work in a really small kind of nimble group. And it's really important, I think, to have all of that stuff inside of your, in this case, basketball, but your sporting operations department. And so I think it's why those groups are getting bigger, because there's no longer just data analysts. It's the data engineer and the web dev and the director of the group, and the data scientist and the coaching analyst and maybe a DevOps person or a utility player, and 2 or 3 people maybe in each of those roles. And so really getting all of that in-house, getting our hands around all the technology, and then iterating on all the stuff we did from an analysis perspective to give more stuff to Quinn Snyder, give more stuff to Dennis Lindsay and Justin Zanuck, and now it's Stephen Schwartz and Bart Taylor as kind of the AGMs there, and really try to bring that into the 21st century. And if you look at around the bubble, the Jazz went from being they were the number 1 3-point shooting team in terms of percentage after the Conley Bogdanovich acquisitions, which was it's not hard to kind of look at the roster and see you go from Jay Crowder and Ricky Rubio and Derek Favors as the complementary players around Mitchell and Gobert, and then you switch that to Bogdanovich and Conley, and obviously a bias towards perimeter shooting and surrounding your great players with perimeter, and Royce O'Neal being a great 2-way 3-and-D guy as well. And so just leaning into that in the bubble and taking a ton of threes. One stat that I love, that if you take Quinn Snyder's last 2 seasons and you aggregate them together, so those 2 years of the NBA, 1920 and 2021, and aggregate them together, the Utah Jazz were the number 1 offensive rating and the number 1 defensive rating over that time, which is pretty ridiculous. I think more than anything else, that just speaks to Quinn Snyder's genius, basically, because to do that with essentially the same roster is pretty impressive. Obviously, Rudy Gobert helps on the defensive side of the ball. So, but yeah, it was a little bit of everything under the sun from a sports analytics capability. And it's what really informed, you talked about that quote earlier. It's what really informed that, if I could go back and do that over again, be a lot more focus on the technology stack, as much as it was on the analysis and the models.
And from an NBA specifically standpoint, like what kind of data? I mean, we know the traditional stats and even your shot charts and stuff. What else? What all is all the data that you're trying to kind of unify more from a game perspective? Obviously, there's college and there's a lot more, but from the season perspective, what kind of data are y'all trying to pull together?
Yeah, I think that in-game stuff, I think the data people in the NBA, internally or externally, are still really figuring out how do I leverage in-game real-time tracking data and use that to make decisions at halftime or at quarters and at timeouts. I'm not sure that there's a great answer, like a very obvious. There's a lot of ways you could do it, and I'm sure teams are trying it. Um, that was the early on conversations that are like, what are the hardware and networking requirements? Like, do I need to put rack servers in the catwalk of my building to not send this out to AWS to process it on site? Things like that, which are, what that latency goes from now 2 minutes to 2 seconds or whatever it might be, and makes that possible. Right. And so I think stuff like that's super interesting. And, we were always focused on. I think another thing that we started doing in my time there, I think most teams have put shot tracking in their practice gyms now, whether usually with Noah. Noah's a great company. They do this at the lower levels of the game too. They have shooting gyms all over the country. It's really, really great product. How do you really leverage stuff like that? I still think very few teams compare basketball to baseball right now. And the amount of technology and attention given to player development in baseball. Now, obviously, the player development trajectory, the ability to track that in baseball is so much more tactile than it is in basketball. But I think that is, if you want to say basketball is sitting in Moneyball 2.0 right now, that's one of the parts of 3.0 or 4.0 for basketball. Every team's going to have a player development analyst, a coach, a movement person to help these guys. Like, how can I teach Tony Bradley, who was at one point when I was there, 27th pick in the first round, young player out of North Carolina, he was an offensive minded center, had to learn how to play pick and roll in the defense in the NBA. And just using that as an example, to teach someone how to play pick and roll, you need at least 4 and more likely 6 bodies. It's very different than hitting or pitching in baseball, where you need 0 bodies beyond the player. If you have one player, you need 5 or 3 to 5 other people. And assistant coaches and video room guys and people like myself are great, but they're not giving these guys game speed. And I'm not going to go get Donovan Mitchell to teach Tony Bradley how to play pick and roll. That's not the best use of Donovan Mitchell's time from a fitness standpoint. And so how do you do that? Right. And there, again, people talk about VR, AR, they talk about, on court kind of the constraints led approach to skill development. Rob Gray's got a ton of really great stuff on this for people who want to go deep on that, and skill acquisition and what's your neuroplasticity and your ability to take on a new skill in a given day, because maybe you're mentally fatigued because you played 4 games in 5 days, and all this type of stuff. You don't get a lot of practice in the middle of the season. Right. It's a lot there. Technology can be a centralized part of that. It's not just analytics anymore. It's technology. Right. And information that comes out of that technology. And how do you centralize that into creating a protocol or a process? When also, by the way, it's really hard to know with certainty if it's working. It is not chess where you can say, oh, well, when we move this way, it increases the win probability by 2% or whatever, or even baseball. And so with this very chaotic, stochastic world of basketball or most sports, to know if it's working. And so those are all the things that are super interesting to me. I think, basketball being this, essentially the second most advanced American sport from a technology standpoint, or, world sport. But that those questions are still largely unanswered, and people are doing really good work in the silos of all these things. But like, the player development coaches at teams are generally great. But they don't know how to write SQL or how to combine their player development data with the in-game data, with the fitness, wellness, health teams data, with the draft data on now how do we think that 27th pick 19-year-old rookie is going to develop over 8 years, right? All that, making all that kind of coalesce into one place is still one big question. I think baseball is probably still hand wringing over a lot of that. So all that stuff is super interesting to me, and I think there's gonna be a lot of space, in pro sports over the next decade to think about problems like that.
While you were with the Jazz, you got a master's in analytics from Georgia Tech. For, students or people looking for career switches or advancements who are listening, what was the upside of that? What did that do for you?
I highly do not recommend getting your master's, on a team charter from New Orleans to Utah, like that takes off at 11:30 at night and lands at 3
Yeah,
a.m. or
yeah.
something like that, right?
Duly noted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Georgia Tech program was great. I can't speak highly enough of the program. They built that program to be asynchronous and online, and I think it started in like 2019, so their timing could not have been better with the adoption of asynchronous learning in 2020. But I had started that process of what my master's degree was going to look like before I got to the MBA, of doing the GREs and the GMATs and the applying and see where you get in first time around, and try to go get scholarships and blah 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 blah. So I had started that before the MBA. Certainly in the back of my mind of leveling up my credentials to be able to make that jump. It just so happened that I got the job in the MBA before I was done with the program. Um, I think for me it was a formalization around especially the statistical and like the machine learning side of things. Like I said, my undergrad was in economics. I've taken all the boot camps, and sure, I knew how to import scikit-learn and run a linear regression model. But I think what the master's degree did for me was it taught me, when is it a linear regression model versus a random forest versus XGBoost versus a neural net, and XGBoost doing grid search versus randomized search versus what's cross validation and blah blah. Like to act, because then to go and to parlay that into the job, you're sitting in the room saying my draft model says this guy's 8 and all the scouts think he's 40. You damn well better have a reason why. And if you go pure black box model, you're not really going to have a reason why beyond your intuition. And one of the things that I did that I think had a lot of the really increased the adoption of some of those protocols we did is we would use feature importances and use coefficients and scaled parameters and things like that to literally say what our model liked and disliked about him. Because if the model likes his age and his school, that's different than the model liking his shooting and his rebounding. And it's important to know those things, because at the end of the day, it's certainly an imperfect science, things like drafting or scouting.
So from the Jazz, you transitioned to work for Austin FC as their director of sports science and analytics, where before they started in MLS, so a brand new team. What was that process of, you've talked about building teams and importance of everything. What was that process? Different sort of league, different kind of data, new club completely. What was the process like for you with Austin?
Yeah, it was a pretty wild 3 months. I did 3 drafts in 3 months. So I
Yeah,
did I
yeah, all
did
the different
so the
drafts.
NBA
Yep.
draft. The NBA draft was in like October, November, that of the 2020 COVID year, and then a few weeks, I think December 1st or 5th or something, was the MLS expansion draft was first, and then the MLS college super draft was in January. And so in the course of about 3 months, did 3 drafts. So I literally, I finished my time at Utah Jazz, was recruited to the MLS. I think to their credit, some folks there, they had Second Spectrum at the time as well in Major League Soccer, and for me, it would fit like a glove to come in and jump into data pipelines and data feeds that I was really familiar with Second Spectrum. So much so that literally the day I started, I basically wrote a bunch of crappy non-sustainable code to spin up a web app to have a dashboard and a model available for our expansion draft, knowing that that was in like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. There was no kind of like formal, like, let's get do a kind of a traditional yearly planning and plan out how it was like, let's go build this thing right away and then figure out the rest later. So that was a really cool experience. I mean, American soccer is probably the most, maybe the most academically interesting to me, from an analysis analytics perspective, because you can argue what league the MLS is in the world, call it the 8th to 12th best league in the world, probably. Probably more towards 12th if we're being honest. And that means the player pool is anywhere from 5 to 10,000 eligible players. And you've seen the playbook now a number of times over with Toulouse, with Brighton Hove Albion, with Brentford, all these clubs that have been kind of managed or run with a data driven tilt to them. And so soccer was something that's super interesting to me because I think because of the worldwide scale of it, because of the nature of the sport, and the nature of certainly the scouting and recruitment aspect of the sport, that is absolutely, a huge place for this. And like I said, the model's already been pretty much proven. Like if you're questioning that this doesn't have a place in soccer, like you're not paying attention.
Right. Yeah.
Bob Voulgaris
Almost
and
every league. Yeah.
Yeah, Bob Voulgaris and Castellone, Toulouse winning the goal differential in League Two France after cutting their budget by 3/4 the year prior. Brentford now like sniffing, trying to backdoor their way into Europe this year, in the Premiership, like 1 point behind Liverpool right now. Yeah, so it's really cool and interesting. Probably not the thing for me to do, spend like my day to day doing. And I was at Austin FC for about 18 months, and but incredibly um, interesting, and I think the one thing soccer does do probably better than certainly basketball, and probably most sports, is kind of the integration of the physical performance data because it's just such an integral part of the sport. How fast you can run is like the number one or two attribute about most
Right.
players that you
Yeah.
care about in a scouting or a game prep context. And so, um, that integration with your high performance staff from a data and technology perspective, basketball writ large does not have that. Baseball, I don't think writ large has that. The NFL, I don't even have a clue. It's a much more physical sport, but um, that is something that the sports scientists certainly in that space. Now, most of those sports scientists in soccer, even world soccer, don't have the technology resources. They're all writing R locally on their computer, and they're usually pretty good at that. But now go integrate it with your StatsBomb scouting data, and make those same prognostications about 10,000 players all over the world to support your scouting group, and that's a whole different. It goes back to the full stack technology side of things.
Yes. So, what's a quick kind of summary of how a soccer team can use that, whatever, the heart monitor, the physical data, whether it's training or a game? How do you generally see a team use that information?
Yeah, I mean, your training protocols are kind of the acute version of that, right? So, what is someone's HRV overnight? What is someone heart rate variability overnight? So, whether that's Aura or Whoop, and integrating all that, getting all of your readiness data, so how a player actually feels from a rate of perceived exertion, combining that with what's their acute to chronic workload ratio been over the last 2 weeks, combining that with what are today's plans, combining that, we live in Austin, Texas, what's the weather outside, and right. And so acutely just taking all of those things and using it to, by the way, your high performance coach has like 15 minutes in the morning to decide, I'm going to hold a guy out, right? Or like he's not going to sit down while you write a SQL query and build an R shiny app to answer that question, right? Like that's in the TV in the coach's room of the full team, all those metrics we just talked about, and maybe some players pop in red, some players pop in green, depending on what day of the week, match day -2, -3, -1, whatever. That's just in the training context. That's now overlay who's playing for the opponent, who are we playing in 3 days. What are all of those metrics like for those players? We don't have their internal data, but you have their match data. So who played 98 minutes in the last match and who ran 15 kilometers in the last match, and who the fastest players are, and what you can, impute some acute chronic workload ratios that way, and say, well, do these guys get attacked on the left or the right side more often? Where are they weakest? Is that related to those players' speed? Because you have tracking data in Major League Soccer now through Second Spectrum, you have all that speed and fitness data, which you don't have with event level, just ball tracking essentially. And so you can now know in a scouting report who the fastest players are on every opponent, what position do they play, what happens when the ball's in their area, do they typically get exposed up that right or left flank, et cetera, et cetera. And same thing in a scouting context, similar type stuff in a scouting context.
So now, this past season, you were an on-air analytics insider with the Portland Trailblazers. I think the only person in that specific kind of role in the NBA. For those who didn't see Blazers broadcasts or missed you on them at least this year, what did you do in that role?
Yeah, it was really exciting to kind of get back into the NBA and do something new. the Blazers, through kind of our little network of folks in this space, reached out to me last summer, and they had internally surveyed the landscape of, certainly RSN is all over the place right now, more so in baseball, but basketball as well. And they had kind of a mandate from ownership from Jody Allen and Bert, who's kind of the Vulcan ownership group, Seahawks and Blazers and some others, and said they wanted them to go be innovative, to go do new things, and they really empowered them to do that. And one of the unique things about Portland is they're one of only 5 teams in the NBA that produces and owns their broadcast. So everybody, the producers, the people in the trucks, the graphics people, the on-air talent, they're all Trailblazers employees. They're not Root Sports or Bally Sports or Comcast or whoever employees.
Big difference there.
Yeah, and so they have literally all the editorial license in the world with how they communicate their games to the fans. They just license it and run it on those networks or streaming services. And so one of the projects they came up with out of that mandate was to have an analytics on-siter in the same vein, for folks who haven't seen it, essentially the same vein as the rules expert who comes in, Jaffe or whoever it is in the NFL or the NBA, Steve Jaffe or I can't remember all their names off the top of my head.
Gene Sidera,
yeah, Gene Sidera, right, NFL, exactly. And basically come in about once a quarter. I also did radio and pregame, halftime, postgame shows in the studio. Game nights were busy nights because I'd end up having about 10 or 12 hits a night, and that's nothing compared to what the play-by-play guys do. But and just add that aspect to the broadcast, because again, similar to a scout, every broadcast is going to use numbers. Why don't we use the ones that our coaches and general manager use? I mean, that's literally the pitch I would give. There were certainly some people, social media, whatever, that were, this is not my cup of tea, and I don't think it's going to be everybody's cup of tea from a consumer standpoint. But if I had to sell it, that would be my sell. And that is, look, Coach Billups looks at the 4 factors at halftime and postgame. So we're going to look at the 4 factors at halftime and postgame, and we're going to talk about, why they started double teaming De'Aaron Fox in the pick and roll in the second quarter, because the Fox Sabonis pick and roll was killing them in the first. And we can actually say in the first quarter, they ran that pick and roll 13 times and got 18 points. And that's a lot. That's 1.5 or, whatever it is. And so just adding that kind of layer to the broadcast was a lot of fun. Frankly, a little less stressful than a different stressful of like, is my Wi-Fi going to go out, or, am I looking at the camera in the stadium, and which camera am I supposed to look at, and those things. But it was a really cool experience to just bring that stuff that is so second nature to not just myself, but everybody who kind of does this job in the NBA, and just kind of bring it to a broader audience and do it over 82 games, where we really had an opportunity to not only indoctrinate, but have a conversation around those things and say, hey, like, yes, the Blazers ended up 12th in the West. Damian Lillard, which, by the way, and I'll have this conversation with anybody, it's a little one way on a podcast, but Damian Lillard is first team All NBA guard. Like, there's no question about it. Like, Damian Lillard had the most efficient, highest usage season of anybody outside of Steph 2016, I think, as a guard.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Not bad.
And to help put that into context beyond just points per game and some of the other kind of traditional stuff was really cool.
What did you learn about communicating data well? Obviously, the biggest difference is, you're trying to talk in 10, 15, 30-second sound bites. What else? What did you learn about bringing those things across quickly and efficiently on TV?
Yeah, I think there was 2 things, maybe 3 things that I learned throughout that. And the first was kind of, it would be similar if you were building a brand new sports team out of thin air, building an analytics department out of thin air today, which would be, you'd have to educate your stakeholders as like, why do we look at things per 100 possessions instead of per game? Why do we look at effective field goal percentage instead of field goal percentage? Like, why are triple doubles basically meaningless if we're trying to predict the future? And all these types of things, and defensive 3-point percentage being another good one that just doesn't really, it's hard to put much to it. It's a number that's there, but it's hard to put much to it. And a lot of those are actually basketball conversations. They're not analytics conversations. Like, okay, are you going to score more points playing against the Bucks or I'm trying to think of who a really slow team was this year, or the Blazers. And the Blazers don't run in transition very much. And the answer is always the Bucks. And if you ask a basketball person why, it's because they run in transition. They fly up and down the floor like the Warriors and the Kings do. And okay, well, that makes sense. Well, shouldn't I measure that differently than when I play a really slow team and they're not going to run up and down the floor as much? Like, wouldn't that make basketball sense to not to like account for that? Yeah, I think every basketball person would say, yeah, that makes sense. It's like, okay, well, let's do per 100 possessions instead of per game. Like, okay, well, why, hey, when you measure field goal percentage, like if you make a three, isn't it worth 50% more? It's amazing how many people, when you say this to, that a 3-pointer is worth 50% more than a 2-pointer. And people go, oh yeah, huh, you're right. I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. It's like, no, it's worth too much, frankly. That's why the league has gone the way it is. But so many people have not just thought about it through that slightly different lens and say, if we were going to measure Damian Lillard against Domantas Sabonis in terms of their efficiency, and Domantas Sabonis takes a bunch of like 13-footers and he's pretty good at them, really good at them, or Joel Embiid or whoever it is. And like, shouldn't we account for those things that one of the guys that's effective field goal percentage? Like, you don't have to start with the fact that it's effective field goal percentage and you must use this metric and it's holier than thou. But a lot of the basketball conversation through the education process, I think, is really important. And continuing to, I think the other thing I learned is continuing to hit on those things throughout the season. And it sometimes probably felt repetitive to me, and maybe even felt repetitive to the person who was locked in watching the Blazers every single night. But that's not the majority of people, the majority of people are maybe watching, even Blazers fans are probably watching 60 games out of the year, or, watching half the game because they're it's how we all consume sports in our own different way. Right. And so being able to kind of hit home with the themes and hit home with the underlying basketball was what was so important, I think. Maybe even more important than like the front office context, because in the front office context, you really go into the weeds about why the model does this, or, why does the shot probability model like that shot versus this one? Here it's much more about the basketball context and tying it back to, in our case, what Lamar Hurd and Kevin Calabro, our play-by-play and analyst, are talking about on air, and actually having that basketball conversation back and forth of, hey, Lamar, great point. You were just talking about the transition defense. Actually, yeah, I'm seeing that in the numbers. It's blah, 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 blah. And boy, that would be like the fifth most of any game this season. And that's just contextualizing what we are seeing and helping people understand, the scale or the context of it through numbers.
Let's talk about one of the things you're focused on now. TourIQ bills itself as the first advanced analytics platform built for PGA Tour professionals. This is obviously a golf site and tool. What does TourIQ do? How does that help a golfer be better?
Yeah, it's funny. We've talked about, it's probably the most sports you guys have talked about in like a 45-minute podcast or something before.
We're getting through all of
them. Yeah, we'll get through all of them. If there was jobs in golf analytics 10 years ago when I started getting into this, I'd have been in that line, not the basketball one, frankly. I'm a competitive golfer, been playing kind of at the state and national levels as an amateur my whole life. Still try to from time to time. But about 2 years ago, got connected with a guy who plays on the PGA Tour named Dylan Fratelli, kind of friend of a friend, lives here in Austin, played at UT before he's been on the tour like 6-7 years now. But I wrote my master's thesis on reverse engineering tee shot strategies based on golf tracking data and club capture data and things like that, and trying to basically understand how a golfer was trying to strategize and break down a hole. So I started working with this guy kind of on a part-time, helping a friend out basis, and we over time coalesced a lot of ideas and learnings and things, and coming back to, what I was talking about earlier of the way we do things internally at an NBA team or an MLS or an MLB team, of the infrastructure and the technology and all the codification around the analysis, because you really want to empower your stakeholder to make the best decision in any setting. And, I looked at the golf space and said, nobody's doing this in the golf space. The economic pyramid of golf as an individual sport is basically the inverse of that of a pro team. If you're playing for the Brooklyn Nets right now as a player, you want for essentially nothing from a game support perspective. You have the best physios, you have the best analytics people, you have the best coaches, you have the scouts who you players barely ever meet sometimes, who are out scouting the next three opponents so you can be ready to know what their play calls are. Goes down the list, right? I mean, there's this kind of internal uh, arms race going on. You have the best chef, you have the best, the best team charter, the best, the putting the recovery, pressure wrap on your legs while you're on the team charter and taking Normatec home with you every night, right? Like all those things. That does not exist in golf at all in any of those levels. And those guys are essentially independent contractors. Certainly a number of them have teams of people around them, but it's up to them to put those teams in place. And so hiring software developers and machine learning data scientists is expensive and hard. And I think golf is in this place where it's the perfect sport to look at from a data driven perspective, because it's a little less stochastic than most, frankly. There's still variability in a million different ways, wind and weather and how the course plays in the morning versus the afternoon and your equipment and all these things. But ShotLink data is awesome. We basically have the location of every ball down to 3/100ths of an inch. And so, yeah, I'm going back, over a decade now. And so my learnings from a lot of the stuff we've talked about, Paul, and the pro sports side, and how do I do that analysis for my stakeholder and just applying it to golf and trying to give these guys a resource to essentially say, how do I break down any hole on the PGA Tour? Like, there's a bunker out there, 295 off the tee. And if I hit driver, I'm probably going to go into the bunker, or I'll have a 50-50 because it takes up half the fairway. Do I hit driver and take on the bunker, or do I hit 3-wood and lay short of it? Or do I play to the right rough with my driver? And so on any tee shot, and this is just one part of what we do, but it's kind of the most acute and easy to understand of any tee shot on the PGA Tour, there might be 3, 4, 5, 6 different options. I was out at the Zurich Classic last week, 16th hole there in New Orleans. 16th hole is this like 350, 360 quasi drivable par 3 if you're a long hitter, but there's water left, and then the fairway tightens up the right. And so what is the trade-off of hitting 4-iron, 9-iron into this green that's got water around it versus hitting driver, taking on the water, but also taking on the green and what would probably be a pretty easy chip if you're right of the green somewhere, but there's also some trees over there. And how do you quantify that? What's your framework for breaking that down? And with the ShotLink data and with some, pretty complex math and I've got a software developer who works with me who's really great as well, and some pretty complex software on top of it, we can surface those insights and those decision-making tools to professional golfers in a way that, as far as I can tell, has not been done before. So I said this in an article that was written a couple of months ago, is just, I basically have just tried to do what I did for an NBA team for a professional golfer and make the economics and make the software scale in such a way that it makes sense, that it adds a ton of value to them. And software obviously helps scale that really easily.
Yeah, as you talk to all these different sports, it does strike me as doing similar work, both from a technical standpoint and from a, as you said, kind of speak basketball or speak golf. Because, if you're on the tee, you're kind of running those same calculations in your head, the risk of being right versus left, whatever, and how, but now you have a way to quantify that. Same thing with shooting from different locations.
And
so yeah, it seems like being able to speak sports with numbers is kind of the theme that's running through all these different jobs of yours.
And golf, ironically, it was not there's no job board for, data scientists for a golf team, because golf teams don't exist. And so it's a little bit of me creating, what I think was always, is now in hindsight, the very obvious end game for me with doing this in the sport that I play competitively and that I'm an expert, or the most expert in, have the most domain knowledge in. Not that I'm a PGA Tour player, but I have played competitively and still do. And it's the sport that I am best equipped to talk about, what you're just saying, Paul, of that, what is that strategy, recommendation, calculation? What do the numbers say? I cannot talk about playing pick and roll against, Gobert and drop coverage, even though I've stood next to Rudy Gobert on a basketball court before. but I can talk about hitting driver versus 3-wood when there's water in play up the left and you have a 2-shot lead, and understanding at least contextually what that situation is like playing at the collegiate level, playing at the national level from an amateur perspective. And so it's a really obvious thing for me. We've talked about my career. It took me a little while to get here, but really excited about what we've built, what we're continuing to build. And, it's really cool to be out there walking a practice round with players and standing on a tee box and saying, okay, there's this and there's that. And even if it's a tenth of a shot, a quarter of a shot, those margins, these guys are so good, and you gain so much appreciation for it being out there. They add up over the course of a round, over four rounds over a tournament, and on average 25 tournaments over a season for most guys. It has the ability to make these really small marginal impacts and really compound them over the course of a year, which is really exciting.
You've talked about being transactional versus transformational in the analytics process, and I liked how you explained this. What do you mean by the difference in those two things?
Yeah, I think extending the golf kind of conversation here, I could send you a text or a PDF or an email or say, hey, on number 6, it's driver, it's not 3-wood, or it's 3-wood, it's not driver, or it's left, it's not right. Numbers say this. Don't question it. Go do it. Thanks for your time. That's pretty transactional, right? And by the way, we could be right, but we're probably not going to kind of instill the thought process and the strategy and the breakdown that we want to, right? And a lot of this is what is our framework for decision? And you can take any of these things we've been talking about, Paul, but what is our framework for decision making here? Like, how do we decide which way to send Luka Doncic in the pick and roll when we defend it? Do we shade him left or shade him right? What is our framework for? How do we decide who to draft? How do we decide which pitcher should pitch tonight, right? Or or what do we hit off the tee on 16 on Sunday at a PGA Tour event? And so, getting to the point where you can discuss that framework and say, hey, here's all the information that we have at our disposal to inform that framework, right? And a lot of the conversations I like to have is kind of at the whiteboard level, and say to your stakeholder, and again, this could be for any sport, but to extend it to golf, say, hey, you're about to show up for a tournament, a course you've never seen before. What are all the things you'd like to know? Like, I'd like to know what kind of grass there is. I'd like to know how fast the greens run. Does the ball tend to stick in the green, or does it tend to, spin backwards, or are they really firm and they go forward? How windy does it tend to be? Where are the pins normally on these holes? When the pin's here on this hole, is it easy or hard from this location or that location? And all this stuff is pretty knowable, right? And so if you kind of ask your stakeholder that information gathering process without injecting, the number, the percentage, the machine learning model says this or that, then you've got a really nice decision-making framework in play already. And for a lot of the golfers I work with, we have these kind of thresholds and say, hey, if it's over a tenth of a shot, we'll really start paying attention to it. If it's over a quarter of a shot, we're getting to the point where it's going to be a pretty strong recommendation. And you put that framework in place, and it takes time. It takes relationship building in any of these contexts, and the trust that, yes, we have information, but we're also considering how you want to play and execute because the answer to guard Luka Doncic might be you should blitz him every time. But if you've got a defensive big who never operates outside the 3-point line, then blitzing Luka Doncic is not really it's not really on your menu of options, right? Like, if you've got a guy who hits his driver 350 versus a guy who hits his driver 290, your menu of options is a little different, right? And so you have to kind of overlay and understand how your stakeholder works, whether that's a coach, whether that's an athlete, and use the information to inform what's the best recommendation for them. Because even with golf, which is this relatively, less chaotic situation, it's just a ball standing still on a tee, and you have to hit it. There are all those contextual things that you have to overlay. And not all of them can be perfectly done. You're taking proxies and you're making assumptions and doing all the things that we do in statistics and using it to try to get to the best decision and having the best process towards that decision at the end of the day. And so being very process oriented and saying, hey, even if you do hit the ball in the water on 16, would you do the same thing again? Did you like the process you went? Luka went for 40, but he made a lot of really tough shots. Like, would we change our process there? And that's the question you want to be able to ask yourself at the end of the day. So that's the transformational kind of, process oriented decision making framework that we want to put into play, I think, in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, it's almost like an advanced way of the old teach someone how to fish, don't just give them a fish sort of thing, and doing that at a higher level. All right, let's wrap things up with our playing favorite segment where we go through a number of your favorite things just to get to know you a little better. What is your favorite number and why?
8, Cal Ripken. Growing up, always number 8. Not a good golf number, but yeah.
No. So that may answer the second question. Your favorite athlete when you were a kid?
Ironically, I 8 is my number from Cal Ripken, but my favorite baseball player growing up, and this goes back to being very, very young, 4 or 5 years old, was Joey Cora, second baseman of the Seattle Mariners back in the day. And for the most, very advanced logic here, that Cora sounded a little like Cory. So his last name.
So you guys are clearly very similar.
Yeah. And so, big Mariners fan, even, 2001 Seattle Mariners still the greatest single season of any team in any sport ever, I maintain.
Yep.
But yeah, Mariners fan from like a lot of kids in my generation, but not because of Griffey. I loved Griffey, right, but not because of that.
Because of Joey Cora.
Yeah.
Favorite golf course that you've gotten to play?
I'll go. I've been very privileged to play a lot of very cool golf courses. I'll go a little off the beaten path though, and this is probably for like all 2 people who love golf course architecture.
Let's go.
The way I do. Mike Strantz is the greatest golf course architect of all time. Passed away 5 or 6 years ago. Tobacco Road in central North Carolina is the coolest golf course I've ever played. It is. I think of like it is so interesting. It is so funky. It is weird. There are a lot of beautifully manicured. It's still in good shape, but there are a lot of beautiful, every place they play a US Open is cool and interesting. And I think the USGA has done a much better job of the Country Club last year, LA Country Club this year, way different than the Shinnecocks and Aaron Hills of the world. And so those are better. They're more of this vein, but Tobacco Road, Mike Strantz, look it up. There's a lot of good articles and pictures of it out there. It is a hoot to play.
I like it. I like the different answers. Favorite nerdy thing that you track? This personally, just kind of nerdy thing that you keep track of.
Sticking with the theme, I guess. So I have a launch monitor device that when every time I go practice, I am probably overdue this, like analysis paralysis for sure. So every swing I take in practice, like I will go to the range this evening probably and hit balls, and I will track the path of the ball. If you think about it in degrees by which when it passes, where it contacts the ball, is it going into out or out to in? I will, track the angle of the face relative to that path. So that's how you know if you're going to hit a draw or a fade, or in my case, a slice or a hook. Club speed, carry. So you get about a dozen data points with TrackMan. Yeah, with all these things. And something I do for my players, but I also, this part of this work I do for myself, aggregating that information over time and seeing it trend over time and seeing how it correlates with on-course performance it's not trivial to do statistically, and it's really impactful as well. Like if you're getting better at something in the range, how is it translating to the golf course as well?
This is why I haven't gotten into golf, because I would do exactly that and drive myself crazy for better and worse, and probably my wife crazy for definitely for worse. But finally, your favorite "how did I get here" moment? One of those moments in your career where you're just kind of able to take in for a sec, like this is a cool place my job has gotten me to. Favorite "how did I get here" moment?
I've been lucky to have a few of these. I've been able to be in a lot of NBA arenas and a lot of meetings with some pretty impactful people around the NBA. But again, sticking with the theme and because it was probably the most recent. This past week, I was at TPC New Orleans, the Zurich Classic, walking practice round with a few players. I can't say who the players are, but two guys who were just happen to be paired together and pretty high ranked players in the world, and talking through how to hit a tee shot with them and their caddies, and looking at our system on an iPad, standing there and talking through that it's a pretty pinch me moment. As someone who that's the sport that, I really resonate with more than anything else. And so, yeah, it was pretty cool. And it was last week. So, a little recency bias, maybe.
A little fresh. It's good. I like it. All right. Cory Jez, former team executive, analyst, entrepreneur, working across a variety of sports. We appreciate you joining us here on Expected Value.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Back in the True Media studios, I'm Paul Carr. Thank you to Cory Jez for talking with us on this episode. You can follow him on Twitter at JezData, J-E-Z Data, and check our show notes for links to his TourIQ website, a couple profile pieces on his work, and more. I'm joined now by someone else with a varied resume, our producer, Sergio de la Espriella. Sergio, hello again. I know you enjoyed this and the wide variety of things we got to hit on here.
I did. I really, really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed the little swerve you gave me at the beginning, introducing the podcast. I am very excited every time we do this recording of the intro, a little behind the scenes. We do the intro and the end after our interview, so kind of a little production snafu that you can see, or not snafu, a little production behind the
Magic.
curtain magic. And Paul, every time I'm very eager to see which athlete he chooses by the number of the episode. And this week, yes, it is 61, and you picked Roger Maris for obvious reasons in 61, but he wore the number 9. So I was like, oh, that's the first time you've referenced a number that wasn't the jersey number. So look at me with doing the stats on the Stats podcast.
I give you a tease also. Mike Greenberg and Paul Hembekides wrote this book called Got Your Number, which kind of goes through numbers 0 to 100 in sports and assigns them like who owns that number. We're going to have Himbo on the pod in the coming weeks. So there's a little bit of inspiration from him. This is also things we used to do in the ESPN research room
That
back in the
makes
day.
perfect
So
sense because my birthday's this weekend, and my aunt actually came over yesterday and gifted me that book. And now I realize I read the introduction. I read the intro where where Greenberg talks about how the philosophy professor was like, "Are there really answers to questions?" And he was like, "And then I left the class because there's always an answer." I was like, "Oh, I was really living that boat." We can talk about that at a different date. This one is all about Cory Jez, which I really thoroughly enjoyed, Paul. I really did. My ADHD brain is loving the bouncing back and forth between a bunch of different sports. I am just now getting into golf. And by getting into golf, I mean I downloaded the latest EA PGA Tour video game because golf is expensive. And so that is kind of my way of getting into the sport. And I think my favorite part of this whole episode was the dichotomy of the sports that Cory had worked in, primarily in basketball and the NBA, and then with this golf project that he has in this company that he runs, and how he was such an um, active golfer, as he was saying with his background. I found it very interesting that the way that he used data in both, or uses data in golf, and the way he used it with basketball, they're very similar. And sometimes you feel like that's kind of at odds with each other because golf, like baseball, is a what I call a stagnant game where there's different situations. Something happens and then the action stops, or like football. The action stops, here's the new situation. What do the numbers reflect on this new situation? Whereas basketball, like soccer, which he worked in with Austin FC, or even hockey, they're very free flowing, right? The games are, I call them a little more artistic because you can't really ever predict exactly what's going to happen. Whereas in something like golf or baseball or football, you kind of have an idea of all the different options that you have. Whereas there's a bit more creativity in the moment with the movement sports like basketball and hockey and such. So for me, it was very intriguing and very interesting how someone can take the root of analytics, why we use it, and it can do it both in a way that a more fluid game can understand it and apply it properly, and then also a more stagnant game can understand it and then apply it properly as well. I thought that kind of gets to the gist of what we here on this podcast try to preach, right? Where that marriage between what's happening on the field or court or grass versus what the numbers on a piece of paper are saying, and how we can use those numbers to further elevate not only our experience as fans watching it or as writers or in our position with our company at True Media, but also the people participating in that event and how they can improve as well. So very interesting to me, top to bottom.
yeah, it goes a lot to just being able to think about things. I don't know about the right way, but a certain way. Think critically, analyze information, like some of these universal skills that can apply to almost any sport, and also kind of to one of the things that I think he said that we know, but it's just continued to grow over the past few years, is how important the back end of stuff is. for these sports teams. He talked about how they'd basically hire a data engineer first before he'd hire a data analyst if he's starting a team's analytics side. The importance of being able to both like warehouse the data, but also surface it in useful ways, make it more accessible to everybody. Like that's super important. And I think it's only getting more important because, he talked about the thousands and thousands and thousands of shots that are available through ShotLink for golf. Or, Tegan a week or two ago was talking about whatever it was, a terabyte of data or something from one game that of baseball, basketball, whichever one it is. There's just so much data. It's like being able to organize that. And yeah, so somebody asked me like how to get into just generally sports analytics, I often tell them like in some ways you can almost do whatever you want, but don't think that you have to be like a math major, a computer or an analytics major. Like there's a lot, you can do computer science, you can do a whole bunch of different things, but just there's this back end, and that's even more hidden, as kind of opaque as the sports analytics field can be to those on the outside. I feel like another level beyond that is the data engineers who are doing all the hard work that, same thing at our company where, we have this little bit of a public face, but like if the engineers here are not building, processing data, building good websites that teams use, like this company isn't here. And it's the same thing on the team side. So I don't know. It's just that
they are our
technology,
max players.
yeah, it's not more important necessarily than the analytics side. It kind of is though, I guess, because if you don't have, it's the foundation of a house. Maybe you don't have the foundation. It doesn't matter how pretty the house looks or how good the house is. Without that foundation, it's all going to just kind of fall apart and not do anything eventually.
Yeah, I kind of equated a bit to like mining for gold, where there's so many numbers, so much information, so much kind of being thrown at you in a figurative sense that kind of sifting through all that data and sifting through all those numbers must feel like, the gold rush in the 1840s and 50s. You know what I mean? It's like, well, okay, I have to go through all of this, but when I do get that one piece that matters, it's going to be worth it. And that kind of information is like gold right now to sports teams and even, our media partners as well. It's a way for them to boost their coverage. We're at the dawn of a very important, I believe, 5 to 10 year stretch, not just in sports data, but in sports. Because I think everyone, even from the most hesitant person, and your more, quote unquote, traditional coach or player or even sports writer or fan, even they have to admit that, oh, okay, I can see some of the benefit here. And if we can grab those people who really from the very beginning were kind of either against it or just not willing to embrace it, which I think we're starting to see now. Yeah, that's something that I think is going to be very valuable in the sports world as a whole. And I'm very eager to see how something that personally I love so much, like sports, I mean, any sport I love, I'm very interested to see how it shapes it and where it goes in the future, so that eventually, when I have kids, how are they going to experience the game versus how I did? The days of me watching Dwayne Wade in 06 literally go to the free throw line 35 times in an NBA, literally carry the Heat to an NBA Finals title. I don't know if those days are there anymore after what Steph Curry did just 10 years later. You know what I mean?
Right.
Something like
Yep.
that with
Game
analytics.
changes. Yeah. And that kind of reminds me of a couple other things that Cory touched on. One is like, as a TV analyst, and this is from my TV background too, use numbers that they're using. People ask, why are you putting WAR on a baseball broadcast? Why is OPS a thing now instead of batting average and stuff like that? Which are reasonable questions for someone who's, watched the game for a long time. That's what they've seen. And one of the best answers, I think, is exactly that. This is what managers are using to make decisions. This is what front office people are using to make choices on players they're going to sign. Like we're trying to, in the media world, in some ways, you're trying to reflect and use information that is being actually used. We're not just making this up for the sake of doing that. You're trying to reflect actual usage and what matters and how choices and decisions are made and things like that.
I also think there's a humanistic aspect to it, and I'm sorry to cut you off there, Paul, but I think if we would have had WAR and OPS and soccer expected goals, or these analytics that have kind of become more common, at least amongst my generation, I'm turning 27 this week, kind of thing, like younger, I could say,
kids.
the children, right? The children. if they would have published those in the 1950s, when in the box score, when, you know, Joe Schmo was picking up the newspaper before having breakfast, before going over and checking the Yankee score from the night before, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be in this situation. It's all about, it's that humanistic
It's
behavior
habit
of
for sure.
we're comfortable, of habit. Exactly. So once we kind of break that, then I think we can be in a bit more of a better place to, you know, listen to the analytics and stuff like that, which is a great life lesson, not just in
Yeah, no,
analytics,
I
but
mean,
it's working out in analytics.
that's the approach I'd take at ESPN, like building graphics, and it's let's put QBR on a graphic instead of passer rating. The graphic doesn't have to be about QBR. You know, maybe you're really highlighting the completion percentage or something in the game, but if that's like the second or third thing on the graphic, and you just kind of keep doing that, and then like by the end of the season, everyone's kind of comfortable with it. And the next season, they're like, oh, why isn't QBR on the graphic? You know, things like that, which sound kind of silly. But, and Corey talked about this too. Like on TV, you say the same thing in not every game, not literally the same stat or whatever, but you use the same kind of stats in game to game or every other game or whatever it is. And people just get comfortable with it. And it's the only, I mean, it goes that way for anything in life, but it's in TV and sports, especially. It's a lot of it's just exposure to everything. The one other thing I want to hit real quick is he talked about just quantifying sports conversations. And a lot of it is just, what do you want to know? You know, you don't even have to use a number sometimes, but I do this when I talk to soccer analysts. I'm like, what are you watching in this game? I'm not asking them for what stats do you want me to give you, but it's just, what are you watching? And let them talk soccer. And that's my job as a statistician, as an analyst, is to figure out, okay, well, they're keeping an eye on set pieces. Well, let's see, what are they doing? You know, where's the ball going? How many of them are completing? What shots are they getting off of it? You know, whatever it is, you know, let the story tell itself from the game, but have the numbers to back it up. And so, yeah, it's what do you want to know? We don't need a number. We just know, you know, what are you keeping an eye on? What's important to you in this game?
It's how I must imagine my girlfriend feels when we watch a movie together and I turn to her after a scene that she thinks is completely inconsequential. And I was like, "Did you see that acting choice?" She's like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Oh, you know what? Never mind. Never mind." It's about
Yeah.
how you watch things, not
Yeah.
if you're watching them, you know? So.
I'm the same way with movies. I come at them from more of a technical side where like
Mhm.
I had kind of a technical media training. So I'm like, whoa, did you see that cut? And my
Mhm.
wife just stares at me. Or yeah, I'm a dork and I totally
Yeah.
embrace it and accept it.
It's who we are, Paul. It's just we
I
all
know,
have our different quirks.
for
It's who we
better or
are.
worse.
We got to embrace it for the
Yep,
better.
for sure. All right. Thanks, Sergio. Thank you one more time to Cory Jez for joining us on the show. If you want more conversations about really anything that we talked about, we've had people on the pod before. Justin Ray in golf analytics and TV, soccer guests like Sarah Rudd, used to work at Arsenal, NBA employees like Spencer Anderson at the Pacers, even Keith Goldner, who's VP of Data Science at FanDuel. So you can find more on just about any of those topics we touched on in our archives. While you're there, subscribe, rate, review the show, please. That helps us continue to grow. And you can follow us on Twitter. Follow True Media on Twitter at True Media Sports, TRU Media Sports. Even email the show if you have ideas or feedback, expected value at truemedianetworks.com. On behalf of producer Sergio De La Espriella and all of us here at True Media, I'm Paul Carr. Thank you for listening to Expected Value, the podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world.